Let me prefix my remarks by saying that it's going to be very tough for me to introduce and create the right amount of headings and uh, uh, subtitles, because I like to make general points of admission. Uh, I like to make early concessions, as it were, and to outline my position where I'm coming from, so as to uh, uh, make room for the right amount of intellectual charity in order to give some spectrum of interpretation or variance to the things that I'll say, because there'll be some details that I won't get quite right, but the point of me elaborating on certain issues which I perhaps won't get quite right is that I'm making general thematic points, which I do think I have at least enough uh, intuitive bearing on the subject matter and the examples of the things that I've seen about an issue, that I can make generally correct, pertinent conjectures, essentially, which, at least in some kind of standalone fashion, should be functional reasoning. Should be a kind of standalone point, even if they don't quite pertain uh, to what I'm ostensibly attempting to address, because I've made a factual, incongruent supposition or something like that. Um, but yeah, I don't think I'm guilty of misreading these things, although I imagine that I'm going to be trampling over so many sacred cows that people will say that my remarks are just fundamentally missing the mark entirely. Um, I think that if you steelman my position properly, and you juxtapose the themes that I get into, then perhaps you'll see that my criticisms do pertain. Um, anyway, let me get into the thick of it. So this is basically going to be an attempted critique, but probably just going to be a pack of criticisms on the Less-Wrong community. A community which, as far as I can see from surveying it from the outside, is a community that I would definitely not want to waste my time being involved in, essentially. Uh, in some sense, they have quite a lot of let's say, the general template of the psychological schema that they are trying to proselytize to some degree has a lot of intuitive, uh, um, mechanistic, operational sort of functionality woven into it. But because essentially they are forced to um, describe it and brand it and promote it under the banner of something that has to be fundamentally sort of secular and in some sense also anti-intuitive, they have to do it under the banner of essentially a negative value worldview. They don't have positive principles. I mean, and um, they have heuristics. They have things that in some sense supplement the lack of principled thinking, the lack of structured intuition in some sense, um, and they are operating in the field of trying to refine their putative principles. Um, refine them as essentially personal heuristics through the wrong facility, through essentially the understanding, which they correctly know is a kind of via negativa, that you can only understand essentially what doesn't work. You can't understand what does work in a notional conceptual sense. So, in some sense, how theories are grounded needs to come from something higher, but because they can't do that, they have to sort of settle with almost what their name even infers. They have to settle for tending towards being less wrong, moving towards, like a parabola. The problem with this is that what can I say? The necessity of intuition, and which, to put another way, I would say the necessity of faith, because intuition and faith, I believe, are functional synonyms. But which is something like an a priori set of bundled values, something like that. But okay, how should I get into this? So, the understanding is like a knife, and at some point, the thing that wields that knife has to be something that can cut itself, something that confronts that paradox that the only thing, the only character of intellect that is capable of, in some sense, being the image of the agent of the operative intellectual schema that is modeled as the image of the self, is something that is capable of cutting itself. The understanding is only a knife. And so the thing that is capable of cutting itself is, of course, the intuition. And so these people, instead of delving into the mystery directly and knowing that then, that they have to decode the mystery, that they have to confront the mystery, instead they continue fiddling with the knife and cutting things and cutting things and cutting things. That's essentially the exemplification, the illustration of essentially the self-imposed retardation of, I would argue, this community, essentially, which is instead of developing an appreciation of principles and delving into the mystery of needing to ground principles beyond the simultaneous mystery of the understanding, which can only be grounded from the place of first things, the third segment of the divided line, in the realm of the intellect, and not in the realm of the seen, or in the realm of the intelligible and not in the realm of the seen. So I mean, I'm a kind of Platonic anti-realist. Instead, what these people have done is they've said, no. Well, we can be less wrong, tending towards finding more correct beliefs. Our beliefs can be right, not that we can have a correct understanding, we can have a right understanding, rather than saying, no, the understanding is only capable of falsification. So they end up reifying, inductive reasoning, which is, to my view, eminently an oxymoronical proposition. Inductive reasoning is not a thing. You might call it inductive rationality, but anyway, now I'm making a semantic distinction between rationality and reasoning, and I don't want to talk about semantics right now, but the so in order to both save the idea that you can have good beliefs, essentially, they've clinged onto Bayesian inductive statistics, essentially, to supplement for the lack of being able to ground in a principled way. Instead, they end up clinging to a narrative that has entrenched heuristics, which is something like the scientific worldview, and something like the scientific methodology, which is sort of horribly backed up with this, sort of disgusting idolatry of statistical inductive reasoning, essentially. And so with that kind of horrible web, they can displace principles and intuition uh, for, in some sense, a kind of iterative groping of their intuition towards having right and good beliefs and understandings, rather than the understanding is a facility, is a faculty, and it's a knife and it cuts, but it does not produce, it does not construct. Um, Only principles do that. So these people, I would say, are archetypally, I would link them to the concept that I have spoken about when I specifically criticized rationality rules, in particularly the debate between him and Stefan Molyneux on the issue of free will. But all the things that I said against rationality rules and characterizing him as a cerebral histrionic, I think that general characterization would append and apply to the less wrong sort of general ethos and their kind of the model of psychological schema that they're working within, and in which they will be, sort of be beholden to. Now, I will say that there is some scope for a kind of introspective uh, phenomenological self-inquiry, when you talk about things like being able to iterate on your own intuition and things like that, and in some sense running up and directly confronting the hard problem of needing to kind of bootstrap some kind of epistemic um, use of intuition. Uh, Sorry, did I just say that right? Needing to epistemically bootstrap some kind of operative field and domain in which psychology um, is being entreated within some kind of worldview. But because essentially they have made that worldview essentially de facto the kind of the scientific methodology without some kind of philosophical context, that somehow, we should just be in the image of the role model of science, and we can use that as a yardstick, as a measuring uh, um, uh, uh, you know, you have already incepted yourself into essentially a quandary which is insoluble, or at least intractable, which is in some sense also symbolic of the parabola that is tending towards the line. They have they have imprinted on that narrative, and therefore they are incapable of honestly and directly contending with the mysteries of grounding proper principled thinking. They have reduced principles into a kind of heuristic grab, uh, um, or groping. Uh, they're grabbing onto these things that they have no justification for holding onto, or for claiming possession thereof, other than what's the alternative. So they're kind of, to use some nice spiritual metaphorical language, these people are spiritual debtors. They can't be creditors because they don't have the thing in the first place to give. They have a negative thing in the first place that they demand to be able to grope and to take possession thereof. Um, and so the general ethos, I would say, of these people is going to be, in some sense, a kind of brittle honesty and a kind of parasitic debauchery, or self denigration, but also a kind of are you meeting these sacred cows? Are you meeting these tests? Are you meeting these standards of, like, do you seem to be as efficacious as the scientific methodology? And so, because you can't amount to the mythology of a Ponzi scheme, which is capable of passing off the fruits of its supposed methodology, as it has essentially usurped the fruits of real agents, real intuition that has fed itself supposedly through the filter of the scientific methodology. It's the idea that what are you exactly apportioning to science other than the idolatry of a heuristic as the displacement of actual principled thinking? Um, what is the value of inductive reasoning? What is the value? These are questions which they are fundamentally begging in the basic outline of their worldview. And these are perhaps questions which are forbidden to be asked, because the question is, well, what is the alternative? Shall we all join some kind of crazy cult that we can't justify in some objective ulterior sense? It relies on essentially entrenching itself with the shield of hard skepticism, and in some sense, it is quite enamored of. It's going to fall into the trappings that the sophist fell into, and I mean, you can see marks of this all over. Um, uh, well, I did have a look at the front page of the Less-Wrong thing. I mean, you have there people doing stupid things. They're effectively trolls. Perhaps I can't tell if they were consciously trolling or unknowingly trolling. Trying to defend logical fallacies by steel manning the use of logical fallacies. It's it's that's what you do when you have a knife that can only cut, and then you try to turn that negative facility into a positive value, which it can never be. It only happens when you live in a narrative, when you live in a tunnel reality, um, that then you can be sort of opportunistically uh, protective about, in some sense, and then you can have this weirdly sort of unconscious, sadistically edged, what I can only generally describe as cerebral histrionic. Um, so, uh, the need for intuition. Um, Now, so what what is needed here, in some sense? I mean, what I'll just talk about my epistemology is that I'm an epistemological pragmatist, and in my pragmatism, though, is centered around the agent, the subjective sense of self, which I think can be known, that you can know thyself, but that also uh, the nature of the operation of consciousness, the nature of free will. Um, what was the topic that I was just trying to get into? Sorry, what was I just trying to prove? I was trying to prove that, uh, or evidence. My epistemology. So, what I'm just basically trying to get to the touchstone of is epistemic responsibilism, as opposed to epistemic reliabilism, an internal locus of control. And when you center your epistemology in an internal locus of control, and you realize that truth claims or epistemological merit is essentially sourced through agency, essentially, is fueled by agency, then you have a negotiated sort of pragmatism in terms of having a moral domain. And in some sense, the moral domain is the only paradigm in which I think that there can be some kind of claim of a objective shared reality. And so I mean objective in the sense that you can have something like a shared reality, but that itself is not based on outside authority. It's a kind of emergent outside authority, which is contingent on a kind of, you could call it an agentic participation, but also the structure of that participation will be intrinsically endemic into or correspondent with the basic or intrinsic structure of consciousness itself, that it will share the same metaphysical properties of the interior structure. And so, in some sense, the only assumption that I have to make somewhat axiomatically or a priori is that the contact that I have with my own consciousness is of the same fidelity as the metaphysical paradigm that I extend this moral sphere of operation as being so in some sense it is merely to say that there are one instantiations of ideal forms is something like that kind of axiomatic claim. I mean, it's almost it's very similar to the assumption that the law of identity or something like that. And in some sense, even that is contingent on an agent providing the merit for that, because that in some sense only becomes true, in the sense that you are listening to me using let's say a shared convention. I mean, is not language constructed in this sense? So language is almost the closest thing we can probably have as an illustrative case of study of something like metaphysical consciousness, and that's also how my model of psychology is based and predicated, is in a study of prepositional verbal valency and working out that there are different spheres of psychological function which in some sense exist fractally, in some sense, within one another, like a set of Russian dolls, in which some are encapsulated by cruder and grosser valences of operation, but they all interrelate in quite a dynamic way, which is what happens when you have a kind of dynamism between 17 spheres of psychological reality, or anyway, that's quite a tangent. I'll just park that to the side, I guess. So, so where am I? I'm criticizing Less-Wrong for living in a narrative, and in some sense consciously living in that narrative, but just, I mean, so I think in some sense I wish that I'm pointing out and illustrating the end of the road for people who have sat in that space, in that community, in that worldview, and are perhaps at some point calcifying themselves under the, in some sense, probably some kind of ritualistic cynicism which is needed in order to cope with that being the general model of interfacing with that form of experience which is inculcated in that worldview, and one in which you actually do need to get into the creepy, mysterious stuff, or the strangeness. But I do think that in some sense, people who have indulged into the less-wrong community have done so because they were looking for I mean, in some sense, I do think that these are people that are just looking for ways to prove imminently in real life, in immediate circumstances, that they have a tool set that they can use to demonstrate that they have done everything that they can so as to justify, some kind of scission, some kind of final judgment, so that they can sort of move on to something, or that they can conclude some matter or something like that, or that they can shut the door on needing to consider something. And the need to do that, the need to sort of engineer that kind of finality as well, or perhaps of entrenching rightness in themselves, is in some sense, the general theme here is essentially the escape of humility, the wish to escape the never-ending humility, which is part of life in some sense, that your beliefs are never right. Again, they're only ever capable of cutting. They're not capable of constructing. Because principles are not the same thing as beliefs. I mean, you can have beliefs about your own principles, I guess. And again, like, even the principles themselves are not corroborated by beliefs. That you merely have beliefs that would seem to correspond with a set of principles, but in some sense, I mean, I don't think that you ever get to instantiate principles in some sense. You can point at them. You can't invoke them directly. You can gesture toward them, but it's much like the concept of purpose itself, is that it never arrives. It's somewhat timeless. It's not in the you could call it that it's in your soul. You could say that it's the heading of your narrative. It's the bearing. It's I mean, this is what I use often to prove the concept of spirit. That's what the spirit of something is. The character of its purpose. Where is it heading towards? What is it leading to? What is the tendency? And the tendency of a spirit is in the discerning of the spirit. It's in the eye of the beholder. It's not an objective claim. It's not an outside independent thing. It is issued from epistemic agency. And in some sense, I mean, I'll say as well that I also, I correspond, I would say, quite happily with many things that I can't claim to be to fall under the heading of Christian, because I disagree with so much of conventional, traditional Christianity, essentially. But I do believe in the scripture, and you do have to just read it, the correct translation of it, the King James, 1 John chapter 4 and chapter 5, And when you get into that Christ consciousness, which is quite explicitly in the doctrine of Christ, and then you read some secular papers, which I'll point out correspond with that philosophy perfectly and directly. If you read Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency, and you read Vasti Ruot's chapter on living with nihilism in the book On Nihilism, which I think is the perfect philosophical distillation of Nietzschean nihilism, that gets us to the point where essentially in terms of the understanding, we can say that our values correspond with these instruments of understanding, these tools of belief, but the thing that is comporting them is something like an a priori appreciation, which is, in some sense, according to the understanding, it's an arbitrary, eclectic arrangement. And, just trying to bash people over the head for having less wrong beliefs. Well, what is your metric of correctness if you're not just going to use some kind of disgusting, totemic, vague and nebulous standard like, well, science is a role model, and Bayesian statistical inferences, or some kind of inductive heuristic, which, I mean, it's hideous. I mean, it's anti, it's anti-intellectual, essentially. I mean, it's wholly without any kind of hope of ever grounding itself, other than having the worst kind of semantic word game, or sort of false authority, or just sort of pointing at effectiveness or something like that. I mean, effectiveness on what metric? Effective, as if words have a kind of stable, static purchase on reality. You suddenly have this huge chain of unsupported assumptions, which are so philosophically inept. It's disgusting and pathetic. But and all of this just gets sort of cargo culted along, because it's necessary. It's necessary for people who are effectively stuck in Keegan stage 2, perhaps trying to tentatively colonize Keegan stage 3, but from a firm foothold in Keegan stage 2, which they're not capable of doing the actual rebirth by water. They're not capable of being reborn in the unconsciousness and starting from nothing, essentially. Starting from the present, and being reborn in the mystery of the present. It's too much that they're going to be. I mean, this is what you should have done when you were 14 years old. This is how you should have grown up when you were 14 years old. But because we live in an unenculturated, sort of disintegrated, we have hollowed out intuition and faith from the culture. We have banished it. We have displaced it with essentially the cult of scientism, and the less-wrong rationalists are trying to flog a dead horse, or something like that. I don't know. And in some sense, in all the more sophistication that they have, I think that they will end up breeding more toxic intellectualism, as you'll just get more and more of this cultish observance of, something like that you can reduce every issue into some kind of statistical confidence standard deviation or some bullshit like that. Focusing in on conflating things with weird forms of sophistry, which in some sense will continue to sort of banish clear thinking. I mean, this will be slightly unfair for me to take this example from their front page, perhaps, because this is perhaps, I have not spent a lot of time there, but I mean, I take my views on listening to the Stoa discussion of community members and leaders of this Less-Wrong Rationalist group, and them talking about the importance of science as a model, essentially, for being correct or something like that, but also, on their front page they have things talking about I don't know if I should even try to get into a specific example, because it's just going to be somewhat sophomoric anyway, but some guy was trying to defend the non-central fallacy, but he wasn't technically defending the non-central fallacy, but in effect he also was, because he was in some sense employing the fallacy in the defense of the fallacy, somewhat creating a paradox and sort of sneaking it in as a kind of axiomatic qualitative component of epistemology in some sense. It's becoming sort of the judge of its own court, and therefore to actually confront that weird construction that had that implicit paradox laden within it. It becomes intractable, but also he was, in how he was supposedly. I also don't like how they use the word steel manning. I don't believe. I mean, this might devolve into a semantic squabble, but you can't. I think it's incorrect to say that you steel man an argument. You don't steel man arguments. You steel man the disposition of the interlocutor. That is the man that is being steeled. And in some sense, when you're steel manning someone, you are not giving charity to their argument. You're giving charity to their disposition, to their intellectual disposition. And in some sense, you're saying, well, there's a failure of communication, perhaps, and there's a deeper substance here. And there is probably a kind of putative steel manning where you have ended up putting lipstick on a pig, and it was always originally a pig. And in some sense, then you have failed to steel man because there was nothing to steel man there. There was no substance underlying it. Perhaps you've in your putative steel manning in practice, you found a way to move on and segue into a similar subject matter that had sort of greener pastures and held more intellectual import and significance to delve into, and then the steel manning led into the attempted steel manning led into a positive outcome. But that isn't what steel manning is. It isn't intellectual charity. In some sense, it's a kind of respecting the intellectual integrity of the interlocutor. But if there isn't any intellectual integrity there to begin with, then there is nothing to steel man in some sense. And so, anyway, so I think that language could be cleaned up slightly, but essentially what this person was not defending was, he was not defending, I would argue, the non-central fallacy. He was defending a qualified use of someone, or some people's use of the non-central fallacy when there is something there to be steel-manned. And just to elaborate on what I think steel manning actually is that you're essentially, because many people can seemingly use fallacies or mention things that contain fallacies, but they are not actually directly referencing or depending or relying on the fallacy. They, in some sense, are using it in a very sophisticated way. Perhaps they're using the fallacy as a way to, in a conscious way, that it is a fallacy, but you see, because it's not so much, you can use it as a door, you can use fallacies as a conduit to getting into meta discussions about very deep things that often involve the moral sphere, because it's not so much that the fallacy is wrong, it's why is the fallacy wrong? How is the fallacy wrong in a particular situation? And if you have a reading, if you have an intuition as to why it is close to the truth, or how it just fails to miss the truth, you can employ it and deploy that reasoning in a conscious way of why that particular fallacious form of argument is precarious, and you can use that precarious nature as a kind of as a way to conglomerate attention and focus on something that is being meta-analyzed, some kind of a meta-analysis, because in some sense, obviously, this is perhaps a very sophisticated kind of interlocutor, but there are people that do that, and perhaps that's not a case of needing to steel man. I mean, the more general case of steel manning is that people don't share the same convention. They don't share the same knowledge base on technical details and matters, but just because there's a failure of communication or a failure of interpretation because of not having some kind of shared conventional languaging on issues that require some kind of consensus on how deep phenomenological, philosophical, or epistemological issues, which in some sense can't just be spoken about directly, because they need some kind of shared epistemology first. And so if you haven't, and perhaps people share very similar epistemologies, but they don't language it the same. So, without actually building some kind of awareness of the distinction or the contrast between different epistemological schemas, or sort of how their value structure is laden, it's just off limits. You can't talk about sophisticated issues, without. I mean, sometimes it is easier to just sort of jump into them and see if the other person is capable of duplicating and tracking the specific moves that the other person is making, that they're independently creating a model of the other person's gestures that make up, essentially a worldview. But, that requires interlocutors to be both sensitive and somewhat intellectually empathetic, and capable of essentially having the patience and perhaps holding their tongue of constructing a tentative, somewhat disparate worldview, and tracking that and very carefully calibrating that, and then until they've got enough of a three-dimensional model that they're therefore capable of steel manning, because so they've been tracking and trying to build a model of duplicating the other person's worldview, but because of failures of communication and perhaps because of efficiency and time, because instead of doing it laboriously, they're doing it a little bit haphazardly, but that's fine as long as the other person is capable of steel manning, as long as the other person is capable of now this I would not strictly call this intellectual charity. this is just part of the actual dynamic of having a rich and expedient form of discourse that's also, it does require some sensitivity or skill, perhaps, or some talent, or at least intellectual resources, perhaps, on both sides. And as I said, it's more about, in some sense, exalting the intellectual integrity of the interlocutor, and you can't steel man in a way that puts lipstick on a pig. It's not steel manning. Okay, that's my contention. That's my view. And then, what's the other point around this? Is that yeah, so you're not steel manning the other person's argument. You're steel manning the disposition that is issuing the argument. And you're reading into the disposition. You're not, in some sense, you're not reading into the argument. In some sense, the argument, for its sloppiness or its inexactitude, is just, is somewhat regarded, perhaps even by both sides at some point, that it was just a means to an end of trying to communicate something that was perhaps difficult to communicate, which might not even be any particular party's fault. It might be a kind of emergent obstacle. Anyway, so in some sense, steel manning is just a necessary part of having a kind of honest exchange, or a genuine or an authentic exchange, because it, in some sense, directly obscures the need of needing to comport oneself according to a strict rule book of etiquette or decorum, or some kind of codex of heuristic, or some kind of totemic idolatry, or set of sacred cows, or something like that are requisite in some sphere of community or something like that. Now, it's not as if some communities don't have conventions that need to be followed, even if I would just say, it's just, it should be well known that those conventions are fundamentally arbitrary on a kind of, on an intellectual level, but they become useful and necessary just in terms of efficiency, in terms of pragmatism, in terms of just creating a more effective, it's an art of being practical in some sense. It has some kind of practically minded anchoring or grounding, or reasoning or justification. Not that everything needs to be meticulously justified, but anyway. Some things like that do just emerge organically, let's just say, and in some sense, they are morally neutral, I would argue, and it's not necessary to go through everything with a moral fine-tooth comb. In some sense, perhaps we can assume that everything is morally neutral until an agent brings it into contestation, or into the general tentative purview of public discourse, or something like that, to be attended to, perhaps. Anyway, this is more. Now I'm talking about politics or diplomacy or something, but let me reground myself. What am I talking about? So, yeah. So I would say that essentially there's going to be a lot of atrophy. There's going to be a lot of calcification, which is going to be part of enduring, I would say, the general I would even say that this is going to seem a bit ad hominem, and I can only somewhat speculate, but I do think that I might be roughly correct about these sorts of aspersions that I'm going to be casting, is that I take it to be somewhat the leader of the LessWrong community or something like that, or one of the leaders, or one of the main proponents of the movement or something like that, and one of the core founding people or something, that at least brought this movement forward, talks about trying to tackle directly great existential threats to humanity. Now, I'm going to be critical about this, talking about the threat of artificial intelligence and things like that. I'm not worried about artificial intelligence at all, because I think that human consciousness would have to be replicated within the artificial intelligence for it to be, and neuroscientists know nothing about human intelligence. You need psychological models for these things. You're not going to be able to replicate any of this stuff by trying to sort of create a silicone brain. It's so I mean, the theory, I would say, is not going to be possible. They don't have the intellectual resources to work out what's going on in consciousness. A simulated intelligence or something like that. It's so you having very sophisticated algorithms. It's I mean, so you scale up at something that sort of can. So I mean, what is the sort of metric? I mean, that you're going to essentially have something that can pass the Turing test, but that can sort of going into this philosophy is kind of useless. But essentially, it's not going to happen. Is the biggest problem? Well, not the biggest problem is the issue of worrying about something that's not going to happen, essentially, when there are actually real problems on the table. The real problems on the table are psychological, I would argue. Essentially, fascism has come back to the world in the form of identity politics, which has been completely normalized. And the LessWrong community just doesn't care about politics, it seems. Or in the way that they care about politics, it's, they're completely sort of obtuse to it, or they've got people on both sides of the culture wars and all those sorts of things. I mean, those are in-your-face real challenges, in some sense, moral challenges, which effectively probably can't be tackled when you've got heuristics taking on the role of false authority. That's a fudged enough sort of epistemic crust that you can allow both sides of the toxic cerebral histrionics to get away with their sort of sadistically edged sort of dark triad Machiavellian social manipulations and such. So because all they really need is a narrative. You give them a narrative, and they're happy. They can perform their Machiavellian dark triad subversion freely. They just need some basic rules that they can use to sort of confound other people and to create artificial partitions to allow them to be able to go and make positive arguments around defending fallacies and things like that. Because all they need is just some metrics, and then they can essentially you can use it to disguise the fact that you don't have a purpose, and that your purpose can only be grounded in a negative value system, which is somehow, we found a definition of how to be less wrong or something like that. We're using these heuristics, and our authority is that we're in the image of the scientific methodology or something like that, or that we seem to be roughly according to those general outlines or something like that. And look how much inductive reasoning we can say that we're masters of. It's a kind of it's a dark magic power game, essentially. Okay, so what's my point? Is that so all of these things that I see as toxic in the LessWrong community, I think, and even in the way, obviously, perhaps the more overt sort of toxic manifestations of what I'm complaining about, they've already self-identified, but they can't deal with the crux of the generative thing that is causing this problem, and because they can't deal with that, it's a necessary adjunct to what they are. This is going to be a looming eminence. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find too much of a poetical way of basically saying that this is going to be a never-ending uh, you're going to have to end up creating rules, which I think they already have created rules. I mean, like I was going to write a response to a post, basically getting into everything that I'm saying in this voice recording, and I just thought it's not going to fly in this community. I'm really wasting my time in a whirlwind of these heuristics that they've already depicted all of these filters essentially, that they can essentially, that these signs, these tokens, that they can complain that your comment or your response does not comport to these signs and these tokens, and it's not in the right format, that they can palpably churn it into the tumultuous, sort of never-ending negative value system. Um, that you know, in some sense, could I make an original post on their forum something like, the need or the necessity for faith, or you know how to the only way to ground intuition, or something like that, or uh, a model for grounding intuition, at the cost of having to give up this kind of pretentious game, um, or you could call it the central game, or something like that, or uh, because in some sense, I mean, calling it a game is certainly useful, because you do have to choose to endorse it. In some sense, calling it a game, I don't see it saying that there is a central game, that you have to commit yourself to bootstrapping yourself toward uh, employing yourself therein. Um, that is how we choose to be givers. Uh, Sorry, I don't want to go off on that tangent. I'm just repeating something that I've said earlier. But um, sorry, I'm just trying to find the thread that I was just talking about, which is that they can't focus on the major cultural problem of identity politics, which is not just a cultural problem; it's a political problem. It's part of, in some sense, the general crisis that we are sitting in. It's I was just about to say, it's not just an ecological crisis, but essentially, you know, the kind of ecological crisis that we're in, I don't believe has anything to do with climate change, or except if we might get some climate change from pollution, but carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, and that's not what's really threatening our environment. It's just regular pollution, which has been that issue has been completely subverted by this siren propaganda and all this weird kind of fake science, I would say, around CO2. But anyway, that's a different sort of point. But it's not just a crisis in material terms, in terms of the economy. It's more a crisis of psychology. It's more of a crisis of the mind, and that and how the mind interfaces with all these uh, spheres of and so I mean it's interesting because I guess the LessWrong community will have a lot of insight, perhaps around specific issues, and perhaps they've done lots of research and things like that on certain things. But I would just think that a lot of the things that they've probably scrounged up on sociology or politics uh, is probably just as obtuse and uh, values. I was going to say morally vacuous, but also and that their values are laden with this kind of pretentious, hollow, sort of armchair, cerebral, histrionic kind of proselytizing about right beliefs. And in some sense, there's probably not enough sensitivity for the necessity of liberal morality in some sense. When I say liberal morality, I mean classical liberal, normative values. That there needs to be an individual sphere of life where people can develop some appreciation of their own personal responsibility and accountability. And if you don't give people room to somewhat fail and hopefully, develop some kind of bootstrapped sense of self-direction, then you've really sort of closed down the engine of sort of the developmental engine. And ideologically, that is what we are, I think, collectively suffering from. Culture has been completely incepted by, quite ironically, almost I would say, the fallacy of the non-central fallacy, is that we have allowed sections of the population, dark triad psychopaths and Machiavellian and sociopaths, to use anyway. If you just look at my last recording on recording before my last recording, I specifically get into trying to deconstruct and derail, I think, what's happening on those levels psychologically. But anyway, probably I just felt I had too much energy to go to sleep, and I was thinking about this in my head anyway, so I just thought I'd make a recording as I sit here in the dark as the electricity is turned off. While the government has no accountability for its failure because of identity politics, essentially. is kind of the long and the short of it. Anyway, let me stop this embarrassing recording at this point at least. But yeah. There are other matters that I need to start dealing with, and other recordings that I need to make, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. But I just need to go back and clean up some of the points that I made, or perhaps slightly elaborate some general sort of things. And this is a lot of sort of complex stuff. So I spoke a lot about a simultaneous mystery in life, or to life, or something like that, which is something that I think characterizes the main sort of crux of Keegan Stage 2, although I generally disagree with at least how Keegan deals with the higher Keegan stages, or 3 and 4. Probably I'll have so, but I'm just using it as a label. And I also think that the Keegan stages can roughly be overlaid onto Plato's divided line. In fact, but perhaps that's just because I'm used with my deep theory of deep theory of mind and model of psychology. I find that these things, I think that Keegan Stage 1 is somewhat encapsulated within the superego. Keegan Stage 2 is the subconscious. Keegan Stage 3 is the unconscious. And Keegan Stage 4 is the ego. And there is something perhaps of a simultaneous state in terms of the status of the ego, which is somewhat present throughout the development, and in some sense the real hazard of development is something between Keegan Stage 2 and Keegan Stage 3. And most people have too much of a toxic holdover from Keegan Stage 2. They don't get reborn into Keegan Stage 3, and therefore they have a kind of puppeted Keegan Stage 3, which then even starts to pretending to access Keegan Stage 4 out of this kind of shared collective group context, which becomes displaced as a system, as a generalized context. So you import a narrative, and you are, the world only makes sense according to that sort of group eminence. And so the importance of that group and the necessity of that group, you get a kind of perverse incentive to entrench that within some kind of a priori, values or commitments or something like that. And, usually it's known that this thing can't be grounded. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that you've created a device or a mechanism that allows for some kind of compartmentalization of these sorts of issues. And you consider yourself to be on some kind of efficient frontier in which it's okay to use heuristics because these are just the most valuable heuristics that there are. And so as long as we're in the image of these heuristics, we're slavishly following them, they are our tokens of authority. We don't have to actually confront, the mystery of true authority. We don't have to have a positive principle around contending with that, which is somewhat solved by, basic religious notions. For example, basic in a sense that they are fundamental, not that they are simple necessarily, because as an elaborated addendum to what I said before about having the metaphysics of your own consciousness is something like is something that you have to see as the encapsulating metaphysic of your external posterior engagement in life and in worldly affairs. That if you don't see that these things are, that the one is the macrocosm of the microcosm, that they are reflections of each other. I'm somewhat, just kind of blithely gesturing at the alchemical, principle as above, so below, or as was in Christian scripture, what is bound up in heaven uh, what is bound on the earth is bound up in heaven, and what is loosened on the earth is loosened in heaven. Um, at least in the valence of the Spirit of the Lord. So you can see how these concepts then get in an embodied, actualized, or self-realized container, but that essentially the model of consciousness, the interior stricture and or let's say metaphysical architecture is the and the thing that does the glue of this binding of what I'm describing is what I was about to say about the simplistic thing is that God loves you and God is love. So if you just believe that God loves you and and God is love, and then the big question is, well, what is God then? And that is actually, and that becomes a complex question. That becomes a very sophisticated question. And I do think that you have to have some kind of Trinitarian structure, otherwise you get absolutely nowhere very quickly. Um, and the word, which is at least, okay, now I'm just gesturing at the actual doctrine and the specifics of it, but just staying as let's say the outlying container, is that once you have that basic, let's say, binding principle that God loves you and God is love, and that has something to do with the image of your self-consciousness, or the metaphysical structure, then you can start constructing positive principles. Whereas the understanding itself is always like the earthen vessel, which is, in some sense, it's welded to dualistic thinking. Notional, conceptual, theoretical implements will always have a kind of will always cast some kind of shadow. Will always have some kind of grammatical, um, which is why things don't hold water in themselves without context. And in some sense, the only thing that provides context is the light of the positive principle in the first place. And so, the unconscious side of the mind, in some sense, can be argued that it must be regarded. That's why you're reborn into it as the first place. It is the third segment of the divided line, but it becomes the first place. And that is a, you could say that there's a motion of faith, and it is the thing that means that you can actually have a stable, intelligible discourse about epistemology and things like that. And in some sense, you have what I imagine goes on in the the Less-Wrong Rationalists community, is that because they're not capable of making that jump or getting into involving themselves in those deep mysteries, and confronting the mystery honestly, with humility, knowing that is the jump that is needed to be taken, and that you might get taken up into a cult. You might become a crackpot. You might be completely delusional and dissuaded when you are reborn into the mystery, as it were, when you give yourself over into contending with those things, and then you will start to realize how you can know the character of your own questioning spirit. Then you can really have a sense of self, or you really have an identity within, let's say, the spiritual paradigm. But because then you give yourself permission to actually discern things rather than understand them according to a bank of what is essentially arbitrary utilitarian heuristics or something like that. You need a higher source. And anyway, so and that source cannot be rationality. Is not rationality. Rationality needs the source to function even. And so the idea that rationality is some kind of standalone sort of thing uh, is, in some sense, to try to concoct a negative value schema, or a schema which is entrenched and anchored by negative values. And in some sense, you just have to say, well, we're at least less wrong, or we're less wrong than you, or something like that. And which is, how can you even make that claim? Where does that claim come from? What is your standard of evidencing that you are less wrong? So if you have to cobble that together as evidence without a faith-based structure, you are going to be using um, symbols and tokens, and it's just going to be fundamental trash. It's going to be fundamental, things that supposedly can ostensibly be similar enough to understanding that. So in some sense, you're saying we'll only deal with Keegan Stage 3 if it comes to us packaged in the same style as Keegan Stage 2. So there's this disgusting kind of conflation between Keegan Stage 3 and Keegan Stage 2. So they always have this leavened, corrupted narrative, which allows them to leverage hard skepticism on all of their detractors. So they are on some efficient frontier because their heuristics are golden, and how can they prove that their heuristics are golden? Or somehow they have to just sort of be utilitarian kings. That's the only way that they can evidence that. So they've got an epistemic lacuna which they are plugging in some sense by mimicry, or by I don't know how they get around that. I mean, they're in a fundamental stalemate, and then they can just kind of say, well, no one can criticize us for not having a better tool than rationality, and using rationality as the grounding sort of force, or something like that. So maybe they have very beautiful earthen vessels, but they are hollow. And so I do call it a kind of retardation, a self-imposed retardation, and trying to point out the hollowness of these vessels is not going to lead you anywhere, because they've already probably created much in the way of apologetics around essentially criticizing. Is going to be somewhat a kind of repackaging of hard skepticism, and the ravages of hard skepticism, and needing, in some sense, to be on guard against the hard skeptical critique, or something like that, and that they fare better than anyone else. They are less wrong than anyone else at escaping the hard skeptical. Anyway, sorry, I'm diverting from the issues that I actually wanted to bring up. So I wanted to talk about the simultaneous mystery, and the only real solution to it, which is basically that honestly confronting the limits of dualistic schema belies the deeper mystery of sourcing authority or justification or rationality. Delving into this mystery and contending with the mystery of the concept of authority, or of God. So in some sense, God does become the binding glue that allows you essentially to transition, I would say, from Keegan Stage 2 to Keegan Stage 3. Because because in some sense I've said, I keep on saying how narratives are poisonous. And the function of God in supplying the narrative is that you don't get to see the world from the Holy Ghost's perspective. That's the function of the Holy Ghost, is that it is the keeper of the soul, the keeper of the narrative. It is, in some sense, it is the story of your life and your future self, which you are forbidden to know. It's forbidden knowledge. You can't know yourself in the future. If you know something about your identity in the future, then the Holy Ghost becomes alive and you become dead, which is essentially what the false ego complex fundamentally is premised on, that you live in your hypothetical paradigm. And so people think that then they can substitute real engaged participation and humble, let's say, engagement with hypothetical thought experiments, which they don't even know what they're doing to their self-concept, because they think that, well, if they've just run through some kind of so I'm somewhat butchering this point, but that's one of the cancerous manifestations, I would say, of the idea that rationalism is something like the primordial matrix, the source code of truth or reality, is you end up substituting actual engaged intelligence with simulated virtual inception in which morality itself becomes a kind of the notion of morality somewhat becomes, I would say, implicitly locked within a kind of what's it called, relativistic paradox, and so you end up subverting the problem of, you know, sort of relativism and dualistic dichotomies. And so you think that you've actually dealt with those problems by essentially finding an autistic solution or a solipsistic solution to that, in which you're capable of maybe saving this new facility within the thought experiment. You know, the thought experiment realm becomes the only realm that is actually morally infused with any kind of importance. So this is another tangent, which I don't want to get into this, and I'm not even describing it that well, but just to put this conceptually, reality is downstream of intuition or faith. Keegan stage 3 can generally roughly be, I think, summarized as the third person perspective of the self, the generalized context. This can be falsely reduced to narrative, in the sense that, you know, you can say, well, you know, that always takes the form of some kind of narrative. I mean, to me, I guess, you know, maybe it's a semantic thing. I'll say, well, narratives are always toxic. So you need to understand that you're in a narrative, but not be the author of the narrative, which, you know, you can do with some kind of religious schema or sophisticated metaphysic, as I've tried to be outline. But and in some sense, you're not engaged in the narrative. You are engaged in the mystery. That is the subjective percipient immersion in the narrative in some sense. And you can, in some a priori sense, call it a narrative, but you can't actually, it's forbidden to actually contend with it on that level. If you do that, you are essentially speaking for the God's eye perspective. And you're thinking that you can perhaps collectively produce a God authority or something like that, and this is why you get these people who essentially fall into some kind of rational social constructivism or something like that. Look, and I know that perhaps some of my position can be said to be so similar, but yet a hair's breadth different from what I'm critiquing and what I am myself representing, but. You know, you can only ever probably organize these things when you have positive principles and a positive value system within which to deal within. You know, you have objects of faith that you can actually maneuver and move around and develop and comport and things like that. I don't think that these things are ever going to be arrived at through atheistic language. Or at least an atheistic moral philosophy or something like that, which is fundamentally entrenched into having to use heuristics and sort of authority totems. Sorry, I'm somewhat losing my thread. Let me. So dualism is bound into the functioning of the understanding. And because you can't escape that, you have to realize that the understanding needs something completely ulterior in order to justify it. And that comes from the third section of the divided line, principles. A proper grounding in the intelligible, which can only be constructed out of intuition and faith in some sense. And that is a mysterious rubric, that is a mysterious set of things contained therein, and you need a teacher, or you need to teach yourself. You need to develop the gift of the teacher, and I would say that a lot of the stuff is present within religion and such. Anyway, so notional understanding is never definitive. You cannot ground authority, and so you end up. I mean, I can see this already happening in the less wrong rational community. Is that you end up creating these ivory towers, these false authorities around inferential inductive reasoning or Bayesian inferences or whatever shit like that. And these are people who very clearly are trying to fashion together a substitute for a God authority, for some kind of binding, cohesive, and then you end up becoming proprietors of that cheap and disgusting solution. Because if not everyone comports themselves according to that dominion, according to that model of efficient, sort of heuristical, because this form of ad hoc, arbitrary efficiency or proficiency is considered essentially to be the substitute for the one, the good. Sorry, that's actually what I wanted to get into, was just talk about how, you see, you can't live without these ideal forms. But because of their hard, skeptical obsession and fixation, or I would even argue to some degrees perversion of this artificial necessity for the understanding to be enough or to be broad enough, is to somewhat, and it's weird because I imagine that they have developed the appreciation that the understanding is not justified. And so, using this hollow metric of just being less wrong, is in some sense a commitment to the idea that this bastion on Keegan stage 2 is going to be the leading light, and the ideal form is not going to be the light that it captures and that is reflected through it, but that it is actually the source of the light. That they really believe that they can have correct and right beliefs, or that there must be a hope to develop correct and right beliefs, or at least improved beliefs. Now, in some sense, I think that all beliefs are fundamentally deficient, and the only thing that saves them is, in some sense, context, and the only thing that will discern the context is something that is conscious of its own values in the first place, in the principia of the realm of the intelligible, in the structure of one's faith. I'm just repeating myself. So, I mean, again, I don't really know what meta-modern and post-rational is. I don't follow these sorts of things. I mean, I do think that it's a lot of pretentious pseudo-intellectualism, probably. That is entrenched in some kind of cult around rationality, and all my arguments that I've made against, for example, rationality rules, I think would generally pertain. But I guess I consider myself a kind of neo-romanticist, which I'm just because I do think that everything must be grounded in the intuition. Uh, um, Essentially. Um, and let's just say a more grounded and sophisticated awareness of issues around epistemology, essentially, and needing an actual epistemology that actually functions and that actually works in a principled, modeled way. Um, and that will not be something that can be understood to be correct. It can only be something that can be understood to be self-consistent. It's not a right belief. Um, and in some sense, it has, well, I mean, and so I think my worldview is completely self-consistent because I'll say, well, I endorse it. That's why it's good, because I chose to endorse it. And it chooses to endorse me, and it also reflects my ability and capacity to do so. So it's self-fulfilling in that sense. Or it's fruitful, I would say, as well. It's capable of maintaining and conserving a kind of efficaciousness of agency, which is its fuel, and which it self-affirms. But anyway, and then, what you have on the other side of this is what I consider to be probably, the shape of people's epistemology within the Less-Wrong community is you're going to have fudged epistemologies baked into some kind of conventional idolatry, some kind of amoral huddling under some central figure of some power or dominion legion of utility. Okay, those were all the notes that I think I had on this. And the only thing I could say is that I do think that this, what I've been whining about recently in some of my other recordings, talking about anxious and bashful emotional tones and how they are used by people to concoct compartmentalization and are very much prone for, when certain cultural, social constructs or whatever, or certain patterns or let's say cultural hegemons emerge that require people to answer to what I've described as anxious and bashful emotional tones. It means that people in the dark triad, people who are very capable of performing social manipulation, Machiavellian feats of being fast and loose with conflating certain things and conveniently operating within the grooves of a narrative that has been entrenched and set down and has enough rules in it that it's capable of being used to provide cover for people to indulge in vulnerable narcissism and other sorts of things. But again, I do think that there is something about rationalism that has this kind of anxious and bashful connotation with it, in that it seeks to banish confused tones, that you're not allowed to be confused in some kind of fundamental way. And I do think that Keegan Stage 2 and the understanding itself is not just, it can't just be bashful about its projects, about, its semantic definitions about what things are. It has to also live up to the idea that it is also inconsolably confused, and that it can't just try to narrate its way out of its fundamental epistemological insolubility. Um, and, in some sense, it must make way for real values, procedures, protocols, processes, notional grooves that are followed cannot substitute for values. And when you make values out of methodologies, I mean, you have already sold your soul, I would say. You have already, in principle, subverted yourself to some external locus of control. And I mean, I would just say that, whenever you find people using statistics to talk about philosophy or epistemology, I mean, you know that you're dealing with people who are, on some level, kind of misanthropic on the level of wanting to reject engaged, participatory, sort of agentic structure, because they are essentially saying that no, those things, those objects, what they are diminutive under the weight of the value of some kind of assumed value in some kind of utilitarian heuristic. And the only way to escape that is to understand the supremacy and the vital importance of faith and intuition, and particular objects of faith. But in some sense, you really have to commit yourself to that wholesale, and you have to see it as the upper echelon, the upper comportment of the phenomenological constellated self. Now, sort of made a reference to Jung, but I just want to say that I think Jung did err in speaking in the way that he spoke about the collective unconscious, which I see it as a necessary evil for him to try to create a field in which other people could engage themselves with and dress it up like a science or something like that, or at least some kind of analytical mechanism that one can delve into. But I do think that I mean, I would still almost be happy to talk on the level of Jungian analytical psychology, but the fundamental problem is that when you treat objects within a worldview in which you have something like the collective unconscious, then you allow yourself to get into this kind of rationality horse trading, because you can objectify things under sort of common themes, that you can say that all of humanity is an object, or you can just sort of take these things as not being aspects of an individual psychological schema that exists somewhere, but you can sort of posit that the archetype itself has a kind of independent existence in some kind of objective metaphysical entity, so it sort of it delegates the mind into a container of eternal objects, which are rationally uh, supported in some kind of objective medium that everything gets pinned onto, which is sort of called the collective unconscious. And in some sense, it's very much like it's like looking at the mind beyond the timeline. No, no, I'm really making junk of this point, but sorry, I need to retrace the lecture that I usually give on this kind of stuff. But essentially, this comes out much better in dialogue. That the collective unconscious is a concept that is so toxic that as soon as it is injected into a worldview as an entity on the same class as other entities, with the same epistemic status, if it's not sort of comported into some kind of very segregated context, with very dubious epistemological, sort of caveats attached to it, what it ends up doing is that, in the way in which you can think, well, they are these things, and then in the same universe there is the collective unconscious on the same level as these other things. Um, you have created a mirror of that hypothetical thing that I criticized earlier, of the hypothetical thought experiment becomes equal in status to participatory, engaged, um, you know, that you can create conceptual themes and valences which have the same epistemic merit as, it allows you to abstract, metaphysical but also, psychological components and elements and faculties. So through just the introduction of that concept, um, self-determinism gets abstracted out of the frame. Essentially, it gets swallowed up in the toxicity of because of how the collective unconscious is fundamentally unknowable, but how it contains everything. And so that's fine if you treat it like the Holy Ghost and you say that it has forbidden knowledge. But it's not treated as if its components are forbidden objects. Uh, they are talked about explicitly, um, rather than just saying we live in the collective unconscious and we can't talk about it because it's unconscious. But that's not how it's treated. Um, and let me illustrate its toxicity. And this is an interesting point because this crops up in many other valences, in others. This the formula of this toxicity is abounds everywhere. So, it's kind of little inceptions and things like that. Is that when the collective unconscious, you can almost imagine yourself that as you are thinking about things or as you are doing things, and you are imagining how that models onto you engaging with the collective unconscious, or in the paradigm that includes the collective unconscious, you are like a rat in a maze and you don't know the shape of the maze. Um, because you're in it. And sorry, usually when I talk about this, I've already explained my model of time, but essentially, let's just say that within the collective unconscious, you have everything is there, but the question is access. How do you access things? And in some sense, you can say, well, perhaps there are things in the past, because of how history has unfolded, have become completely inaccessible. They have effectively become forgotten. But just because they have been completely forgotten doesn't mean that they cannot be pathed to in the future, but they can't be reliably pathed to. We're delving in the dark. So there's that kind of quality of, in some sense, experimenting against unknowable and unconscious forces. And that's also where you get the kind of the sensitivity or the vulnerability to developing, sort of crazy theories about inferential reasoning and inductive. And so already when you're dealing in that sort of paradigm, you have a worldview that has concepts like the collective unconscious laden within it. And in some sense, without those constructs being fundamentally assumed to be real, to dignify that kind of functional operating within some kind of paradigm like that, you're going to be bound and beholden to dealing within a project in which your instruments and your tools, because the assumptions made and tethered to the objects that make up that space, are incomplete fundamentally and are incompletable. And so this is what is served by the concept of the Holy Ghost. It's very weird to talk about something that is ostensibly dead. It's a ghost. It's divine, but it's a ghost. It's dead. It's divine and it's dead. And you live in it. But to call something the collective unconscious, you are tethering, in some sense, the experience of what has been forgotten, what is dead. I mean, you could replace collective also with just universal, the universal unconsciousness, or something like that. Essentially, that's the thing that you can ostensibly know something about, is that you can have a weird kind of generalized knowledge about collectives, about themes, about abstractions. I mean, I've always considered the rendering of the word unconscious essentially to mean real and reality. Because for something to be unconscious, it's not that it's non-conscious. That it's so patent that we only are imprinted on it corresponding to it latently with our consciousness. So, the latent imprint upon our subjective consciousness, as in some sense, I mean, look, I'm slightly falsely conflating the Holy Ghost with the concept of the collective unconscious. These are not quite the same things, but the one, I think, the operative use of the one does displace the proper understanding of the other. And that's what I'm pointing out, that you get yourself into an epistemological bind of, in similar ways that I've criticized the Less-Wrong Rationalists. I think they come part and parcel with certain concepts and things like that. But so essentially, the collective unconscious says that, well, because you can know something about the generalization of the self in the collective, that you have access to a reality that supersedes the individual node, but also that then can be seen as almost like a kind of social constructivist container, but in some sense one that is made out of negative pressure. Perhaps I'm conflating this with the kind of postmodern sentiment. Let me come back to this. I need to go do something. Okay, I've sort of lost my thread, and I'm coming back to this recording a day later. But anyway, let me just try to quickly sort of recapitulate where I am in this argument. So, or in this explanation, perhaps, or perhaps just a description. Perhaps it can't be called an explanation. But there's so many disparate things that I just want to bring up and point out as important ingredients. But essentially, you have to use yourself as a model to some degree, which means that without the concept of likeness being a central axiomatic thing that is connected to the basic metaphysical realm or a priori, so essentially, if you don't believe that a priori structures are fundamentally intrinsic to the context of one's understanding, then I would say that you're already kind of lost. But also, in some sense, you're stuck at just a form of self-doubt, and although you can be self-doubting in sort of other ways within the realm of likeness, and needing to pragmatically refine the model and such, that's sort of because just because you believe that there's some kinds of commensurate sameness between your structure and other structure, let's say apparent disagreement or apparent failure to reach agreement on certain phenomenological points or structures or something like that, which might also be problems of languaging and finding shared conventions, to pathing towards describing those internal structures, which is in some sense, because language can only be made out of external manifestations or expressions of things which exist, within the metaphysical substrate. So, you can only deal with the effects and talk about the effects and then suggest and point towards or gesture at the, let's say, the metaphysical cause or the a priori plane or paradigm. But so again, like the important functioning of that the concept of likeness to self is a central authoritative source of authority, i.e. God, the authority, and that it is in the image of the self, you are somewhat, I would say, fundamentally self denigrating, in a philosophical sense. That means that, well, you might as well just kind of become some kind of lost soul to your own mind. But to order the mind underneath these higher, in some sense, archetypal fundamental properties, which you take to be fundamental as an act of faith, I think, is essentially, the kind of Platonism ideal forms that I say is essentially indispensable. But I just wanted to practically talk about, obviously, the problem with, in terms of knowing oneself, is that there, let me just say this with reference to posterior observation in some sense, but also as someone who has studied psychology and metaphysics and philosophy, is that, or let me just say that I've rather studied phenomenology, which is in some sense the first empirical, the only and first empiricism. Let me phrase it like that rather. That I consider myself an expert in discerning. That although people seem to have the same structure, those structures seem to pertain to different differing fields. In some sense, people seem to have the same template of personality, but they don't seem to have the same style of personality. And so, there's definitely some source of variance, but it's variance within some kind of stricture, some kind of fixed structure. And so, and trying to round that out as an independent field of knowledge or something like that, or trying to sequester that and separate it from the individual is, I think, something of an insoluble kind of thing. You have to do it both, and that's what makes it messy. That's what makes it. You're prone to joining a cult. You're prone to being swept away by some kind of. But in some sense, you're also prone to having those things happen to you, while also trying to avoid or absolutely rule out having that happen to you. So, in some sense, there's no point in trying to live in fear of that. Again, I would say the question is, how do you perform, let's say, what I would say the rebirth that needs to occur to have somewhat of a healthy basis of entering into Keegan stage 3 from Keegan stage 2, which is, I think, generally, and not have the kind of disgusting confection that in some sense I'm always seem to be railing against in some form or another. But I think in terms of the less rationalist community, it is somewhat more conspicuous, this particular toxicity. And so they have a kind of specialized variant of what I've already described as cerebral histrionic sort of psychopathology. Okay. Sorry, what was I recapitulating? That I do feel I've badly described this simultaneous mystery of life, but which is really strangely named. But I guess you could basically call it the simultaneous problem that the understanding itself is fundamentally in deficit. Because it's sort of fundamentally an instrument and simplistic, and it's not capable of grounding itself, but yet it can ground itself in negative values. In some sense, the only stability it has is via negativa, And so because it's a knife, it can cut. And essentially, well, so I always say that essentially how the only way to actually stabilize that in some sense is that you have to produce a knife that is capable of cutting itself, but then chooses not to in some sense. Now, effectually, I think that the less wrong rationalist community has found a way to take that archetypal formula that I've just, a knife that can cut itself and chooses not to. It's not that the knife chooses not to, it's the person wielding the knife chooses not to cut the knife itself, but knows that it can, and therefore the knife itself is fundamentally a kind of fudge. It's like the thing that can reach towards the parabola, but it's not. At some point, it's not useful getting closer and closer to the parabola. It's only as needed in terms of the idea that someone is capable of reaching closer to the parabola than somebody else will only be relevant if the context makes it relevant, if there's actually a real world participatory engaged sort of thing. And in some sense, the real way that you actually really approach the line is that you always avoid that kind of efficient gainsaying or something like that. In some sense, if you're trying to efficiently approach the line better than somebody else on an issue, then you're already accepting failure. In some sense, you have to, in some sense, look at in the opposite. In some sense, not have the goal of reaching the line as a positive aim, but that the line is actually a line that must not be crossed. And therefore, the question is that we're always keeping wide enough berth away from the line, and it's who can stay away from the line the best. Or who can map out a shape that we know that the space within that shape will clearly not approach the line or seem or be seen by others to have crossed the line, or that it can be readily known by others to not cross the line. And so they say genius is in the avoidance of problems that intellectuals are trying to solve. And in some sense, if you're just trying to solve problems that are, in some sense, I would say, somewhat invented or extravagantly, sort of extracted so as to prove the utility of something, again, you're in a kind of prideful vanity over an issue which is probably not even the proximate challenge of the day or something like that. It's somewhat based on a weird kind of misdiagnosis. And in some sense, to somewhat prove the proprietorship of an esoteric anyway, I have not argued this very well, but I have at least illustrated the point, I think, to some description. But anyway, let me just talk more about the simultaneous mystery and its resolution. I'm thinking that I used to be able to describe this so well, and I've messed it up. And I'm actually doubting my own memory about what I used to refer to as the simultaneous mystery of life and its resolution. But, essentially, it's that you have to see the ideal form as the light emanating through the use of dualisms, and essentially, and it's not quite the same as non-dual thinking or something like that, but it is being able to avoid the pitfalls of dichotomous obsessing over dichotomous distinctions as a kind of substitute for actual values. That you're ruminating on making distinctions so as to try to extract some kind of dictatorial permit from some kind of sort of contention of the factors and of the issues. And in some sense, there's a difference between thinking about a problem and realizing that this is not a moral problem because there's an obvious requisite necessity that needs to be effectuated, and alternatively looking and ruminating over almost inventing complexity in order to try to count up inferentially the number of factors that would tend to give you some kind of fudged confidence that something is indicated, or something is more indicated in some kind of hypothetical thought experiment. And when you do that, I would even say that you're actively trying to avoid moral questions, or being an agent with any kind of real, in some sense, you're trying to observe. Sorry, I don't even. All of this shit is so dry. I don't even like talking about it. But now I just think that this is also why I don't want to deal with this community, because I just imagine it would just be so fundamentally toxic. But always having to defend the predictability of these of the. I mean, everything that I'm saying cannot be judged in terms of effects, because they're all about phenomenological stricture in some sense. You cannot judge what I'm saying in terms of outcome. I mean, except on a kind of sociological level, in which case it's already sort of amoral. So in some sense, the only way that, so I would say that, if you gave me a civilization to pedagogically cultivate, that it would be more harmonious and have more integrity, and in some sense the harmony would be a subset of the integrity, and I would say that it doesn't matter if it looked like it had less utilitarian outcomes, but it would be able to conserve itself over the long haul, because it would have fundamentally, it would aim at achieving high integrity and not try to maximize societal trust at the sacrifice of integrity. And to the extent to which that it would, let's say, do some kind of internal horse trading in terms of trying to facilitate high societal trust, not at the sacrifice of integrity, but at essentially trying to maximize high trust, while knowing that certain integrity issues are just, we need things to be mediated, we need a shorthand, we need conventions, we need proficiency and efficiency, and therefore we just need to make sure that there are enough remedial. In some sense, you can make a system that has, let's say, a game mechanic in it where it is designed to be morally deficient, but that that it's not going to be morally deficient in terms of the simulated efficiency that it's meant to somewhat virtually affect, or something like that. And then what you do is the people that feel like relativistically, because the sub game within this mechanism is fundamentally using an amoral valence or something like that, then you just have a remedial thing where you can basically, but obviously you have to design it in such a way that the remedial thing is capable of reproducing from first principles and the actual underlying structure. In some sense, this is fundamentally what admiralty law does in society. People don't realize, but the reason why you're not treated like a sovereign citizen is because you're under the maritime law of the high seas. You're under admiralty law. And if you really want to actually be in integrity, get yourself out of admiralty law. But you wouldn't want to do that, because then you have to administer all of your arrangements. You actually have to contract all the things that you want to contract. It's, and the only way, I would say, if you wanted to get out of admiralty law, you shouldn't get right to it. What you should first do is you should get your house in order, and you should work out alternative amenities and things like that. I mean, you have to be very politically astute and accountable. And when I say not politically astute, but what I would say is that you would have to. What I was going to say is that you need to. Sorry, this is a technical, complicated, tangential sort of point. But I mean, how I see people doing this is that you have to create an alternative to a lot of things in society, as probably as a group of people, and instantiated that within a culture, and then do the work of the legal transition, where you would try to get land patents and deregister your property, and find ways to subvert whatever legislation might exist that would revert unregistered land directly to the state, or you would keep the land registered, but because of the land patents, you would have been able to essentially obtain the aeodial property rights, the unalienable title, essentially. But I mean, but practically, that you would have ways of not needing to depend on any kind of national currency and things like that. That you would have perhaps your own trading block, or your own system, or whatever, and your own fire services, and your own, all these sorts of things. You perhaps even your own mediation or something like that. Although I don't think that you would ever be able to subvert a judiciary in a municipal political entity, unless you actually went for full independence, which I would not. I think that you should live within, side by side with people that are under admiralty law. Otherwise, there is no. So I mean, this idea that you're going to provide a kind of enlightened overlord for other people. No, I mean, these things exist for a reason. They've even evolved for a reason, and within the common law legal framework, I would say that they are still the best that our species has ever within history that we know about. We live in the highest integrity of all times, and in some sense, the debauchery that we see is because we're only able to see the debauchery, the level of debauchery that we're capable of seeing, because we actually do have these legal distinctions and these legal categories, which at least allow us to. Anyway, I'm talking about too many different things. So that whole point was just to make the and it's very interesting, because I would say that world that I talk about, that sort of legal world, is entrenched in this kind of, even in this Christian archetype in some sense, because the respect for the individual sovereign soul is fundamentally in the law. It's just been subverted by admiralty law. And in some sense, if people were to actually disengage from those systems of oppression, or which do need to be done consciously, they can't be done unconsciously. They can't be done for you, I would even say. Or at least, they could be performed more easily if there already was a functioning free man community that did already have a functioning alternative, let's say, state of affairs to transition into. But, if that community did not have the requisite integrity sort of structured into it, in some sense, it's hard to get that level of integrity structured into something when you don't have enough people sort of holding up the general sort of holding the rigging, as it were. It's very easy to forget I would say even psychology within our species has within certain. That's another point that I should add to another kind of recording, that this is getting too much all over the place. But yeah, in terms of how I was just going to make a point about how psychological expression between the gender divide is essentially a way for us to induct people developing and growing in a society into understanding and being immersed in, let's say, the structure of consciousness much more quickly. because we at least perhaps we've been biologically imprinted on, or perhaps it's just a cultural sort of zeitgeist thing. That there seems to be a particular kind of specialization. Anyway, yeah, these recordings are just getting embarrassing. I'm getting distracted by background noises, but okay, let me try to finish. So the reason why I was going on about people divorcing themselves and creating structures of integrity and things like that, in some sense, those are, they don't quite do the job of illustrating the deeper thematic point, which is essentially the toxicity of epistemological pluralism. People who are explicit proponents of epistemological pluralism are basically untouchable. I mean, you can't deal with these people. They are lost in themselves, to themselves. You can sort of, you can't have an argument with them, and in some sense that's what they want, is they want a kind of, they want to debase you through arguing with them. But the only, you can have a worldview that can sort of combat, in a compatible way. You can avoid confrontation with the needing to argue them, with a kind of epistemological pragmatism, which in some sense avoids direct confrontation. And so in terms of that, you could still live side by side with people like that. You just never talk about deeper issues with them. But the problem with epistemological pluralism is essentially that it means that the a priori can never be the father of the a posteriori, sort of effects, and other, so there can be no correspondence between a priori and a posteriori in terms of epistemological pluralism, which makes them more confident in being able to develop inferential reasoning, or whatever you want to call it, inductive logic, and using that as a kind of as a weird kind of idolatry or authority substitute for the fact that they have already at least explicitly repudiated that there is one authority or one truth or something like that. I mean, obviously claims about one authority and one truth are always quite strange, because it's like, well, they would have to be particularly contextualized, but I mean, and semantically delimited to get anywhere. But I mean, but not to get bogged down too much by stupid semantics. I mean, these kinds of things are dealt with explicitly in the Christian doctrine, where essentially there are two gods that are spoken about in the Christian doctrine. There is the God of the world, and there is the God of the kingdom of heaven, and or the God of heaven and earth, which is not the same as the God of the world. And there's a worldly authority that is the God of the world, and there's the true authority, which is and so there's the place of many truths and argumentation, and people that hear the world, who are led by the God of the world and in their camp of dominion. And then there are people who believe that there's a correspondence between a priori and a posteriori. And as I say, they avoid direct conflict, because in some sense they are just only heard of those who... So it's interesting that essentially all the choices that one makes in terms of one's understanding that corroborate values, but don't, in some sense, are not the values themselves, are negative elections. They are essentially subtractions of practice, or subtractions of procedural participatory, let's say, styles or something like that. So, it is, in some sense, to use the slightly poetical expression of it, it is a circumcision of the understanding, that is the the manifestation of a matured understanding, but in some sense the understanding is not justified. It can be justified inside itself, but it's not justified by itself, in the kind of epistemological ontological schema that it itself understands itself. So it is not saving itself. It is the thing that it is in the image of that is saving itself. And so, basically, the ontology is not a material ontology. It's a Platonic ideal form that is the true reality, essentially, which is governed and ordered by the brilliant light of being, the one, the good. The with a capital T, the one, and the good. Anyway, so and that impels the understanding to make distinctions. But those distinctions are not even conserved or preserved by the understanding. The understanding is merely a reflection of, in some sense, the a priori distinction which is being depended on and relied on. And that is also an article of faith, essentially. And the other things that are worth pointing out here is that this is deeply in Hindu religious philosophy, which has the simple aspects of Christian, the Christian doctrine. I think probably even better than most so-called Christians supposedly believe in, which is that, to not have a many-branched intelligence is that the intellect itself, or the realm of the intelligible, needs to be a cohesive web in some sense. It cannot comport in a centralized compartmentalized, sort of it has to be a single understanding. It has to be a single rationale or a meta-rationale. There are some perhaps complicated confluences within certain. Usually, all the complexity comes when you're dealing with, let's say, the grey matter or the grey moral issues of actually piecing through the fallen aspects of the false ego complex, or the phenomenological structural self-impingement and or whatever, and in some sense, like second order moral concerns, which are already sort of proceeding from some kind of moral deficit. Or in some sense, you could say the problems that pertain specifically to the ego segment of the false ego complex. Because it is the ego that has to contend directly, essentially, with these kinds of things that I've been talking about, like with God, the concept of God and normative morality. Now, these concepts are not used, or they do not inform the thinking of people who essentially have a materialistic an epistemological pluralist, or at least one that is not decided against rejecting epistemological pluralism. That's just a sort of it's a question that is not confronted, because to confront that question would be to place their whole psychological schema and their efficient frontier of heuristic mongering and proprietorship into a transient state of well, it would show their whole project as being somewhat lackluster, and at the very least, sort of much to do about nothing, or focusing on the molehill when the mountain is there to be climbed. With their sort of rationalization that, well, if the molehill can be climbed, then in principle any mountain can be climbed, and they've got this weird kind of over reduction, conflationary, sort of idea that as long as they reach towards the closer, like a parabola, that they're making something like real progress with something that's endemic to the basic underlying source code of reality, or something like that. Which is, I would say, this is the same kind of corruption that I've generally complained about as the neo-pragmatism in academia, that somehow, in your specialized form, as long as you're efficiently comporting yourself, that you're generating some useful modeling of something that will be part of the whole, when enough pieces of the puzzle are Newtonianly coalesced at the end of the Ponzi scheme, that somehow all the formulas will amount up into an AI that'll tell us the answer to the question. It's sort of, that's the undergirding kind of mythology that the Ponzi scheme is based on. That you get enough formulas, and then you'll get a self-aware AI that'll say that it understands science, and we will never understand science because we're not as complicated as it, and we should just believe and take its word for it. And so we end up essentially inventing Brainiac from the Superman comic books that destroyed Krypton, as we have turned the Earth into a Krypton. We've turned it into a puzzle. Because we never started with instruments that had a kind of complete canonical capacity of a kind of controlled knowledge that reflects in a understanding that, or a control, and that comes from a bank of knowledge that is sufficient enough that can be reflected in a understanding that all comports together in a cohesive and cogent worldview. In some sense, it is the idea that, well, the worldview can be arrived at sort of by empirically testing and building up to it. And then, you really have the problem of essentially not seriously philosophically contending with the problem of tests themselves, especially when you try to apply tests to huge meta structures like a priori metaphysics, and perhaps even questions like God, or things that are so endemic to consciousness itself, like time. You can only have theories about time. You can't falsify anything about the concept of time. This is already going to be laden in to some kind of phenomenological, you're going to necessarily have something bootstrapped about these things, just in order to talk about these things on some level. There's no safe way to enter that arena with anything guaranteed to you. And trying to bring things in a guaranteed way is essentially just going to pollute everything into a narrative, which becomes a kind of dogmatic, table-thumped external authority. And then you just keep on saying, but look, I can see the external authority. Look, I can see it. How can you argue that you can't see it? And then, you have this disgusting sort of semantic, metaphysical sort of conflation. So I mean, I keep on repeating this because I mean it's worth repeating because I mean these people are essentially, I mean, predicting that these people are hitting their heads against that wall, and they'll never stop hitting their heads against that wall, and so they'll need some kind of pain medication to cope with it, and so then they'll go and say, well, we're dealing with existential crises of the species. I mean, really, as they distract themselves from not. I mean, I would point out. Please go listen to my recording on Tito Mboweni, who's the finance minister in my country, and his proto-fascist tweets and things like that, and identity politics, and just realize how much you've missed the boat. And yes, we might all die in nuclear fire or something like that. And I would say the reason why we have done so is because we can't even police ourselves in terms of normative morality, and we can't even get basic moral questions right, while you are doing this kind of horse trading, which I'll even say that this, what I complain about in the less-wrong rationalist community, and allows sneaking in this kind of narrative stuff, and this Keegan stage 2 arrested development that I mean, I haven't explained that fully, but I pointed at it. All that stuff is essentially what we are also suffering from in all these other domains. And all these other domains have also, just as the less-wrong rationalist community has been able to come up with some interesting semantic, words in terms of how they are sensitive to certain problem areas and the toxicity within their own ranks. Well, yeah, that kind of awareness is also in identity politics. They also say, oh, stop gaslighting people so much, or something like that. Or, it's amazing how they reproduce jargon and buzzwords which really should apply to their project, but which they kind of repurpose against their kind of diverting pressure, and because they're so wrapped up in their own toxicity that they become aware of their own toxicity, but then they just project it, and they kind of it's like a negative feedback. That gets leveraged and hedged as part of a new kind of doubling down, as then they neaten up their dogma, or their the rule book, or something like that. But yeah, so I mean, essentially, the less-wrong rationalist community, I don't see how you don't have ever the means to tackle the kind of philosophical ineptitude that they are prone to. And I mean, I can only surmise that I mean, when you're dealing with someone that is going to try to tell you about inferential logic, and talk about science so much as well. I mean, to not even understand the fundamental philosophical limitation of science, but also how they have essentially debunked themselves. I mean, science has completely debunked itself, and just because you have a system that seems to have some kind of conciliation within it, so that you have an operative domain in which that you can appear to do some very important things that seem to be able to accumulate real progress, and you can say, well, look, you have computers and things like that. Science has given you that. Fuck you. I mean, really, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. How do you know what part of the intelligence gets labeled as science, and not to mention the deep philosophical issues? I mean, like, science has basically just become statistics now, essentially, because it can't ground itself. I mean, we live in a non-deterministic reality. We know for a fact that it's non-deterministic. So now we have to use statistical models, in which case science has lost all. It is completely lost the plot. There is no law in science that will stop anything on my desk from just spontaneously levitating. It's incredibly improbable, but miracles are not even obviated in science, essentially. So somehow I just have to believe that there's some kind of statistical pressure uh, that makes science good enough somehow. I mean, the whole thing is hinged on that basic sort of blind faith. That's how philosophically weak it is, but also how, there has been no progress in like 80 years on quantum mechanics, essentially. And they can't get anywhere because they can't even track what the methodology of science does to itself, through itself, for itself. How it abuses the concept of time, which it can't. I mean, the timeline is a useful way for materialists to support their worldview. Um, but this idea that the future is somewhat fungible with quantum parcels of time, that time is a quantity, that time is fundamentally a quantity. I mean, this is a fiction. This is an assumed fiction that the whole of science is predicated on. Okay, this is not the usual lecture that I give on debunking science, but there are enough recordings on that on my YouTube channel. Anyway, yeah, just repeating myself. Yeah, I don't want to go through the motions of trying to outsmart people who are locked into a tunnel vision which essentially holds no water, but they somehow will hold the default high ground, and you will have to sort of prove a negative while they use hard skepticism against you. As because hard skepticism is their pet and belongs to them and goes after who they don't like and who are detractors of them because somehow they're on an efficient frontier that has no fucking integrity, but they don't have the humility to openly admit that their position holds no integrity. And so to try to pin them down while they use hard skepticism against whatever polemic you have to sort of try to raise within their reality tunnel. Yeah, I mean it's just, I mean this is basically the formula of identity politics, essentially, just in a kind of pseudo intellectual philosophical baggage. And they are just nebulous about the right things. They have the same kind of relativism paradox around epistemology. So somehow they are confident to sit in their armchair judging relativistically objective things, somehow deriving that kind of thing. And in some sense, I don't think a lot of these people, I think they can only get away with themselves because Keegan, essentially was around people in institutions, academia, who believed that they were in Keegan stage 4 because of their cultural high status or something like that, because they felt like they were the pinnacle of society, or that they were the priestly caste or something like that. But essentially, it was a kind of power game, I would say, to some degree, and it was based on denigrating other people. Well, we have the truth and they don't have the truth. We're better than them. We must be in a different category to them. But I'll just say that positioning yourself in an abstract mystery forest, that you're incapable of understanding the content of those mysteries, that you are somewhat subverting and substituting or supplementing by, this kind of systemized collective progress that you are accomplishing in a way that it's too complicated for any individual to properly know about and understand and defend, but that somehow individually uh, you're building a nice sort of Tower of Babel collectively. Um, Somehow that means that you have you deserve to sort of be seen as the center, as the middle ground, as or at least the pinnacle of human development and evolution, because your form of intellectualism, your brittle form of pseudo intellectualism, um, should be proselytized. It should be somewhat butchering this point a little bit. The 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 point that I'm trying to get to is just that this becomes a substitute for Keegan stage 4, and it's not Keegan stage 4. It's a pretender, um, because basically they've been told by Keegan that, well, if you believe in science, that and if you can use tools like science, then you're in the driving seat, and you can see beyond yourself, or something like that. Your conscience is fully capable of operating, or something like that. When instead you just have a kind of a conscience that requires that only functions in terms of your hypothetical thought experiments, within a particular contemplative domain, uh, that is constructed out of a very particular kind of setup. That essentially has all these assumptions that it's not capable of giving up, because then it gives up access supposedly to its ego, to its Keegan stage 4. It loses its system. Yeah, no, I'm butchering this point. I guess I've sort of lost my own point. But in some sense, the real toxicity is in the unconscious side of the mind, is in the Keegan stage 3, which in some sense is so addicted to professing to claim the high ground of Keegan stage 4. And it's this kind of collusion that all stretches down into having right beliefs, which aren't capable of humbly sort of conceding themselves as only being contextually pertinent. Um, and so, because they can't make their understanding contingent on some kind of higher principled context, they are, instead of having principles, they instead just have a model of reality, or a model of the external, which then develops a kind of consciousness, or conscientiousness rather, that is systematized, but which is completely locked into, it's welded and locked into and wedded to, a whole lot of arbitrary sacred cows, and sort of that enforced duplication before you can have the same, before you can enter into the club. And essentially that's all it is. It's a fucking club. Um, a clubhouse with club rules, and it needs that in order to maintain sort of its efficacy, and, let's say, vindicating its image of its self-efficacy, in that, well, if everyone just connected itself to this cult, if everyone just adopted this sort of, it plugged itself into this cloud religion, so that we can all live under the same cloud, we can all be under the same umbrella. Um, And so I do think, I mean, that is in some sense also that's the same formula as a fucking religion. And I mean, there are true religions. Uh, but does this religion contend with the others? And how does it say that they are false? Utility. Well, you say science gave me my computer. Uh, I think I can also say, after I've already extolled my phenomenological worldview, and I can also say, well, God made that possible, and without the sophisticated, in some, because God makes consciousness possible. Anyway, let me stop ruminating on this waste of time.